All right, let's get it started. So my name is Alan Piscitello. I'm the Vice President of Product at Blockstream. I'm here to talk to you today about how to issue an asset on Liquid. So we're going to go through some basics on how a Liquid works and how assets function in Liquid, considerations that you're going to want to have for issuing an asset, and actually walk you through the process of doing that. So first off, we're going to go through, why would you want to issue on Liquid? Why does it matter, putting on Liquid versus another blockchain? What are the advantages? And we're going to dive into the specifics of Liquid assets and how they're different. And then go into the RPC calls of getting into the low-level details, and then talk about a new feature that we just released that is the Liquid Assets Registry. All right, so why issue on Liquid? So Liquid offers many benefits compared to other blockchains. The first one is you have Bitcoin as the native asset. So Liquid has a two-way peg of Bitcoin and what's called Liquid Bitcoin. And it ensures that all the Liquid Bitcoin is backed by BTC. So this is really one of the more interesting features here. You also have the ability to have anyone create assets on Liquid. There's no permission system. Anyone who has access to a node on Liquid can create transactions that create these assets. You define what they mean. They could be used for stable coins or security tokens. You could also have a peg to any kind of altcoin or any other type of asset that you want to actually track. You have improved privacy of transactions on Liquid. So what we have in here is something called confidential transactions and confidential assets. This means that when you send something on Liquid, it's not known to anyone except for the person who's sending it and receiving it what the amounts and the asset type are for the transaction. So this gives you a great deal of privacy for your transactions. But you also have it that any of the amounts or the assets can actually be proven to any third party. So if you have an auditor or a regulator, you can still be compliant and prove that everything is exactly the way you said it is, and they can independently verify that. And then one of the other parts that you have for assets in Liquid is that you have the ability to reissue them. So some assets make a lot of sense just to only issue one time, or other ones you may want to issue many times. So an example of this, maybe I have some limited edition collectible that's digital, and I only want to make sure that there's only 2,000 of them that are ever created, and I can actually prove to the world that there is no way to create more of them. On the other hand, you may have an asset, say maybe like a stable coin, that you may want to issue more of if you get greater deposits in your bank account. So a customer deposits more funds with you. You want the ability to increase your supply. And likewise, you also want to decrease that supply if someone wants to request a withdrawal. So Liquid allows you to do this and has some really interesting features. We're going to go over about how to issue and reissue assets in more detail. All right, so some of the advantages. So Liquid is run using the Elements software stack, and this Elements software stack is actually derived from Bitcoin. So we basically took Bitcoin and made some changes to it to support the things that we care about, like confidential assets, being able to create new assets, confidential amounts, and having a signed blockchain rather than mined. So this is just basically, we have a lot of the advantages of the review process of Bitcoin. Bitcoin has been battle tested. It has hundreds of eyes on it reviewing every change, and we basically can get all of those for free. So that's really nice that we have that security built in. Besides having the software, reviewed in that process, we also have Bitcoin as the native asset. So, Bitcoin really is the most liquid cryptocurrency out there, and so this makes it a natural fit for being the base, the default trading pair for any asset on Liquid. So if you're doing some type of security token and you want to have it be traded, almost all the cases, even altcoins, there's always a BTC trading pair against it. And this is really nice. And Bitcoin's nice because there's no central party to trust for doing that. So you can basically get liquidity of Bitcoin that can now be applied to your asset. Liquid also allows you to issue an asset without having to create a smart contract. And this is something that's very dangerous when issuing an asset on other platforms. When you have smart contracts that are complex, you have the ability that there's mistakes that can be made. And when you have a mistake, made on a smart contract, it's deployed in the wild, and there's not really much you can do to fix it. So we've seen, several buggy smart contracts on Ethereum. Examples of that being the DAO smart contract ended up with an attacker being able to drain the funds. We ended up with a multi-signature bug in Ethereum that ended up black holing funds. But with Liquid, it's all natively at the protocol layer, and this means that your assets are just as high level as the Liquid Bitcoin that's in Liquid as well. So this means if you're doing a transaction, you don't have to do anything special. It's exactly the same as sending Bitcoin. And being able to leverage Bitcoin scaling. This is another key feature of Liquid. So you may have seen, I think this got published today, talking about C Lightning being able to support Liquid. So we added support for C Lightning to support Liquid Bitcoin, and this is paving the way to be able to talk about. This is going to pave the way to be able to handle other assets. And I see there's some questions coming out here in the chat saying that there's problems with sound. So it looks like it's an isolated incident to a couple of people. It may be an issue with your browser blocking sound. Okay. So I'm going to move on, and we're going to get into the nitty-gritty of explaining how assets work. This is a good opportunity to check for questions as well, so we can see here if see if there's any questions. I'm going to go to the Q&A section here, and no questions so far. So excellent. We're going to move forward then. All right, so I'm going to go into a little bit more detail about some features of Liquid and how it actually works, really in the guts of how these transactions work. And to really understand that, first is to really understand the idea of confidential transactions. So the key part of confidential transactions is that the amount and asset type of any transaction are concealed from the public, but known to the receiver and sender of the transaction. So, and this is also something that can be shared and proven to others. So in the top here, you have a public view. This is showing a typical Liquid transaction. If you're familiar with Bitcoin, it's very similar. You have the idea that you have inputs to a transaction and you have outputs to a transaction. What's different here than Bitcoin is normally in Bitcoin, I know the amounts of the inputs and outputs. And in Bitcoin, there's only one asset, so that's also different. So in this case, I can prove that the inputs equal the outputs without revealing what they are. And in this case, you also see one additional output, which is the transaction fee that gets the transaction published onto the network. On the bottom side, you see what the actual issuer, or I'm sorry, not the issuer, but the person transacting can see. So in this case, you can see that there's one Liquid Bitcoin being sent, and there's also 100 USDT being sent. You also see that there's two Bitcoin outputs. One is the fee, one is likely change going back to the original sender. And we're sending 45 USDT to one address and 55 to another. So this is really showing what's in here. And actually, it's a simplified version of even the private view. If I'm the receiver of an asset, I only see the parts that apply to me. So if I, for example, and let's just say what I'm doing here is one person is sending 45 USDT to someone else. The only part the receiver would see is the 45 USDT, and everything else would be a mystery to them. But they would still be able to validate that everything's correct. So this gives you a lot of privacy. If I'm sending someone Bitcoin right now, they can a lot of times see, how much I sent and identify. Maybe I had a large wallet and I may have a large amount of Bitcoin, and that now makes me a target to whoever I'm sending money to. With Liquid, it's all completely confidential and hidden. So that's a very interesting feature. All right, so inside of Liquid, we don't have any kind of official names of assets. So when you create an asset, it just has this long hex string, and this is actually a real asset that was created in here. It actually is USDT. So if you're hearing, we recently announced Tether has been released into the public for Liquid. It's an asset on here, but it's just this big hex string. So that's how you know it's actually Tether. But for users, that's not exactly terribly readable. I'd have to read and memorize this long string. That's very hard to do. So we have the idea that you could also create an asset registry. And so Blockstream has created one. Anyone is free to create their own asset registry as well. And it defines information about the asset. So you have something like a name here, a ticker, and precision. And we'll talk about why precision is important in a future one. But the idea here is you want to know, when you create an asset, you want to think about how divisible is it? And there's some important considerations on that. All right, the last concept in here is the idea of something called a reissuance token. So when I create an asset, what happens is I have the ability to say I want to create more of it later or not. And if I decide I do want to create more of it, that means that something called a reissuance token is created. And a reissuance token is just like any other asset. It can be stored in any kind of wallet that you would store any liquid asset in. This means you could also do things like store it in a multi-signature wallet. So in this example, we're creating an asset and we're also creating a reissuance key. The asset's represented on the left and the reissuance key token is on the right. The left asset is just sent to a normal wallet and the reissuance token is sent to a multi-signature wallet. So for example, if you have something like Tether, you want to be extra secure that the supply of Tether matches your bank account. And in this case, they would want to have multiple parties sign off on creating more of that asset in the future. So if you could see here, if some of the tokens created got into the wild, that would be bad, but not as bad as a token can create an infinite number of the supply in the future. So this is why having a reissuance token that's separate in a separate security model is important. So then when we want to actually go reissue the asset, we have the wallet here. We can sign with both of these keys in this case, and it's going to enable the reissuance token to now create more of the asset and send those out to additional people. So this is an important consideration. We'll get into why and how you can use the reissuance token effectively, but it's important to understand it's just another asset that shows up in your wallet, and we'll see that exactly when I create an asset as part of a demo. All right, so before you get started and before you do anything, technically, it's really important to design your system and design your asset to meet the requirements that you actually have. So we really have kind of four conditions that we care about. Do we want the issuance itself to be confidential, or do we want it to be open? Do we want to have the ability to reissue assets in the future, or do we only just want to have a single issuance? Where are the assets and reissuance tokens going to go? And what is the precision of the asset? So I'm going to jump into these one by one. All right. So when you create an asset in Liquid, the amount of the asset can actually be revealed to the public in a known way, or it can be hidden. And I'm just going to show you an example here. I'm going to share my screen just 1 second here. And let me go to Tether. I'm giving a lot of Tether plugs today, it seems. Let me share the screen. All right, so this is the issuance of Tether. And you can see here, we know that exactly the issuance amount and the burned amount of this asset. And this is all public information on the blockchain. Anyone who's parsing the Liquid blockchain can figure this information out. And you can see that there were 5 different transactions that were involved in either issuing or burning this transaction. We're actually going to go to the oldest one first, just to kind of dive into the detail here. So the very first issuance, we can see it was a new asset created. We can see all the information about it. And we can see that there was 1,000 of it created and 1 reissuance token that was also created. So this means that they have the ability, if we monitor this token, we can see exactly what are the conditions needed to reissue it. And you can see that they have created more. This is one that's kind of interesting here. It actually burns 500 Tether. So this is simulating redemption, and more reissuances as needed. So it just got started. So we will see this number grow, but this is basically how you can see what the issuance is. Now, on the other hand, you may have an asset that actually is confidential. And this means that the amount here would be unknown. So if you actually dig into the transactions, no one would know what the asset, how much of it was created, except for the issuer itself and anyone that they shared information with to prove that issuance. So if you have an asset that has actually needed to, you don't necessarily want to reveal this to someone. Maybe it's only a small number of users care about this. Maybe you're keeping track of stock of a company and there's only 5 people involved, and you can trust them to keep that issuance amount private. And that would be a reasonable reason to do that. If you want to prove to the world that there's what the supply is, and it would be infeasible to just prove to them individually and to keep it private, you might as well just issue the total amount open. All right, so the next consideration is, should I create with reissuance? So this really comes down to the use case of your token. If you plan to issue more of it at a later time or shrink the supply, that's a good reason to do it. You may want to create an asset. Even if you want to have a fixed supply, you maybe want to have the ability to create more for a use case that, say, a user loses the keys for the asset. So a security token would be a good example of this. We're not going to get too much in the weeds on liquid securities in this talk, but the idea would be, if someone has an asset, we know who they are, we know they have it, and they tell you they lost the key, you could potentially replace that asset, and then based on liquid securities, it does like a blacklisting of the token so that they can't be moved again. So that's another reason why you might want to do it, just if you want to be helpful for someone who's lost keys. You could dilute the shares of an asset. So maybe you're a security token and you do the Series A round, and that's with one token, but then you want to create more at a later date. You could do that as well. So if you don't want to create a reissuance token, that would usually be because you're proving, that the supply absolutely cannot grow. This is something where you want an ironclad collectible or something that is exactly, known. If you had a token representing a gold bar, like one specific gold bar that's in a vault, you're not going to ever want that number to grow or shrink. Or maybe you had a token representing some land and you wanted to give someone fractional ownership of it, and it was just representing one part of it. That's something that you really don't want to have more of it created at a later date. All right, so then the last part is, or I'm sorry, not the last part, but the next thing related to that is, what are you going to do with those reissuance tokens? And I talked about it already. You want to make sure that these tokens are secure, that they have, they basically can dilute the supply of anyone who already has it. So it's very important to get this right. So we have the ability to have multi-signature reissuance. So that's one key consideration you want to do with this. So you can create a multi-signature address in Liquid just like you would in Bitcoin. And the nice thing is, even if the token was in, there's nothing private about having the token in the past, because I can send it to someone else and know all of the reissuance supply is accounted for in this multi-signature address. So that's really nice. You can change the security. Maybe you have a board of directors that you want to have the majority sign off on spending any more of it, and your board of directors changes. Well, then all you need to do is spend that token and send it to the new multi-signature address. So there's no risk in having old keys or having those separate concerns compared to just the Bitcoin or liquid security model of having a transaction that moves the ownership somewhere else. You may want to create multiple tokens. So this is, maybe you have different sets of parties that you want to be able to issue them, maybe one multi-signature and one that's like a super user, or one that's an emergency backup. Those are reasons why you might want to create multiples. And you want to make sure you do have some of these backed up in some type of cold storage or some type of process that you can recover it in case you can lose the original keys. So it's always good to have a couple of copies and just make sure that they're all secure. All right, the last one is the asset precision, and this is something that can be confusing, and depending if you're using the API or not, you need to be aware of this. So Liquid in general, all the APIs assume that one token has 8 decimal places. This just goes back to the Bitcoin of 1 Bitcoin equals 100 million Satoshis. And so all the APIs, since we are based on Bitcoin, do rely on that. On the other hand, you may not want to have 8 decimal places for your token. So if you have like a security token, it doesn't really make sense to have a fractional share. If you have a stable coin, say like you're using Japanese yen. Japanese yen is 1 unit. There are no divisions of it. You may want to have 0 decimal places. And part of the reason why we want to do this is the confidential transactions in Liquid rely on something called a range proof. And a range proof will prove that each output is greater than a certain value and less than another value. And in this case, it's making sure that you have at least one Satoshi and it's less than 68,719,476,736 Satoshis. That's a pretty big number. Now, the key here is at the Bitcoin level, that's only 687. Now, for Bitcoin, that's a good chunk of money. 600, that's times 10,000, you're getting, $60 million being transferred. Has the same amount of privacy as one Satoshi, which is a fraction of a penny. That gives you a very wide range. If someone does send more than 687 Bitcoin in a single transaction, and the range proof does account for this, it does grow, but it does kind of tip off someone watching, hey, this asset is using an amount that's a little bit larger than what we normally see. So it's better if everything blends in. So if you're not using precision, that's a pretty long, 68 billion, that's a pretty large range of things that we can have in here. So try to maximize that as much as possible. This does mean as an issuer, you need to be conscious of this and use the APIs at the appropriate level. When you're, if you don't need to divide it at all, use 0 decimal places. If you're doing like a USD coin, you may want to only use 2 decimal places. Maybe you have your reasons for fractional pennies or not, but basically you can decide that. And it's up to the display of wallets to use this. And this is where the registry that we'll cover later really comes in handy and is really helpful. So now I'm going to check see if there's any questions. I don't think I saw anything popped up here, but I'll just give everyone just a couple of seconds here. If you do have questions about what we've talked about, and I see in the chat as well, there might be questions that are popping up. There is an official section here. I don't see any, so I'm going to move on. All right, now we're really going to get in the weeds. So if you're a programmer or highly technical, this is going to be directed at you. And if you're not, maybe you can just watch and maybe see that it's not so scary after all. All right, so I'm going to go through how issuance actually works. So a little bit kind of high level. How do we actually create an asset in Liquid? And we looked at it really quickly on the Block Explorer here, but I didn't go into a lot of detail. So basically, when you create an issuance of a transaction, you are actually taking an input, and it could be Liquid Bitcoin, it could be any normal input that you have, and you're adding additional information to it, saying, hey, I'm creating this new asset. Here is information about it. Is it public? Is it open, private? Am I reissuing it? How many tokens are there? Or a commitment to a number of tokens without revealing the amount. And I'm sending those outputs somewhere. So for, there's always going to be like a Liquid Bitcoin output in this case. There's going to be an asset output. There's going to be a token output if I'm doing a reissuance token. And a fee will always be there just to make sure it gets confirmed on the blockchain. So when we actually looked at, and when we do create one on our own, I'm going to look at the Explorer and I'll show you exactly how that works. All right, so we're going to dig into the RPC calls of this. So if those of you who are unfamiliar, there's a couple ways you can do this. Liquid, the Element software stack has what's called a command line interface. So you can call, you can start up a daemon for this. You type elements D after you've downloaded the software. And then you type elements-CLI and then whatever command you're going to do and whatever arguments it has. We also have something called elements QT, which is a graphical interface into the wallet, and it also has a debug window, so you can actually call all these commands directly from here. And that's what I'm going to do. It's going to save me a little bit of time, make things a little bit more clear. You can get help on them as well. So there's really three key basic issuance commands that you can do. First one is issue an amount. And so when you issue an amount, you need to say, again, those things that I talked about before. How much do I want to issue? How much do I want to reissue? And do I want it to be blind or not? Is it confidential? The next thing I might want to do, if I can reissue it, is just call reissue asset. And this works as long as you have the reissuance token spendable in your wallet. It doesn't actually destroy the reissuance token or anything like that, but you do need to prove that you are capable of spending it. And again, you're picking what asset you're reissuing and what asset amount you're wanting to issue. And then the last thing is destroying the amount. So how much do I want to destroy versus which asset? And I can put a comment for my wallet on this as well. So I think it's time to start diving into that actual demo. If I remember my slides, I'm actually going to talk about this real quick first, and then I'll do the demo. All right, so we do give you a lot more control too. So those are the simple use cases. What they do is, they are storing things directly in your wallet. They're always single sig. They're assuming, if you have a Reissuance token, you have full control, and it's the most simple way to do it. But you may want to do things that are more powerful. So this is where the advanced features come in. This is raw issue asset. So it takes a little bit further steps to do this, and this is actually what is required to do things compliance with the registry, and I'll talk about that later. So we have what's a function called raw issue asset. This is something we'll talk about a little bit more later, but the idea is you can pass in additional information about it. You could do like many issuances all in one transaction. You could send it to a very specific address directly. So we use this a lot for the securities tool. And then we have raw issue asset, and this is a way to raw reissue asset. This is a way to reissue them. Basically, you can have signatures from multiple parties collected independently and then put together in this function. We do have examples on how to do this. So if you want to look at docs.blockstream.com, we have a lot of examples on exactly how to do, in the weeds on how to construct these. If you are looking for those examples, it's pretty boring to do in a webinar, so I'm not going to do all of those directly. I have a script that does most of them. All right, so I'm going to demo creating an asset. Let me go back to sharing my screen here. So I'm going to switch screen, and let's go back into my debug window of Elements. So this is Elements Core, and I'm going to up the font a little bit so you can see it. And what you're seeing here on the screen, I just did a help command, and it will tell me everything I can do. So the first thing I want to do is I want to actually issue an asset. So let's get help on it, because just to make sure we're going to do it right. So help to issue assets going to tell you exactly what it's going to do. For example, I need to do the amount, the token amount, and the blind. So first thing here, I'm going to issue a new asset for this demo. I want to create 1337 of it. Notice I'm typing in here. If you can see it, the part I'm typing is really small. I need to do it at the Bitcoin level. So for this token, going through my checklist, I want it to be reissuable. I want it to be open so everyone can see the amounts. I'm just going to let it go in my wallet because it's not that important. And I'm going to use, I want 0 decimal places. And then I do want it to make it reissuable. I'm going to make 2 keys, one for my own purposes and then one for backup. And then I want the issuance to be unblinded. All right, so I'm calling the command here. And we actually have a transaction ID. You can actually see the full command right here that I sent. There's some output here. This is entropy. This is how these asset IDs and tokens are created. And so we have a Reissuance token and an asset. They are showing up in my wallet. And I'm actually going to go to blockstream.info and show you exactly the transaction. It should have made it by now. Let's double check. And I know y'all can't see it right now. I need to just switch the screen. Give it a minute, and there we go. There's a transaction. I'm going to zoom in a little bit so you can see it, but it is unconfirmed. You can see the transaction fees I paid. And as I mentioned before, there's 1 input and 4 outputs. Now, the Block Explorer has no idea which one of the outputs is liquid Bitcoin, which one of them is the Reissuance token, and which one of them is the asset. But when I zoom in on the details on the input, you can see that it had that extra information to say, hey, I want to create an asset. I didn't specify a contract hash. We'll get to that with the registry. I created 1,337 tokens of the asset and 2 Reissuance tokens. So we can see this was all in the open. Everyone can go out and validate that this number is correct. But what happens to it after this point? It's anybody's guess. They don't necessarily know. So we have that. All right, I'm going to do one other thing. I'm going to switch back to my other screen here. Apologies that I have to bounce back and forth so much here, but so I'm going to call help issue asset. And it tells me what I can do here. And again, it's just exactly what I mentioned previously. I am going to get the asset ID. I need to remember what that was. It was this 140. So I can say reissue asset. I can type the asset ID and the amount. I want to create, let's just say 10 more. All right, so there we go. It's got the transaction here. We created 10 more. And if I go back and put that transaction in blockstream.info, we can see that there's two things here being spent. We don't know what they were. But on the second one, we can actually see that this is a reissuance. Here's the asset, and I forgot to do the Satoshi, so we actually created 1 billion of them. So that's nice. We made a mistake here. It's a happy mistake because we can actually go back and do one more thing for the demo. And we can call destroy amount. We want to destroy it for this asset, and we want to destroy 10 of them because that's really, 1 billion. Oh, insufficient funds. I need to wait for this to actually confirm. So let me see. Oh, I'm sorry. I grabbed the wrong asset. That's why it didn't work. I had the wrong amount here. So yeah, let me see. Oops, I've got the wrong command here. See, this is the problem with using the. So I want to say get balance. I want to say string here. I want to say 0 confirmations, include watch only, false, and I want to say the asset label, what asset do I have? So it says I have 10, but if I look and see that there's only 1 confirmation, oh, it's got a confirmation already, so there we go. We should be able to destroy it now. Let me see here. I might have run out of liquid Bitcoin. So apologies on that one for the demo, but basically I could destroy that as long as I actually had the liquid Bitcoin, and too much practicing this demo ran me out of funds. So let me go back to stopping the screen share. I'm going to switch back to the slides here. And it's a good opportunity to see if we have any questions. And all right, don't see any questions yet. That's, I guess I'm either explaining things well or everyone's sleeping. All right, so now I'm going to talk about the registry. So this is the last topic, and we'll wrap up after this. So I mentioned that the liquid assets registry exists. Inside of my liquid or my elements full node, there is the feature to label assets. So this is really important. You want to make sure you get this right. You want to make sure you're not, using the wrong asset and keeping track of those hex things are there. So we do have the ability to put things in a configuration file. You just need to put it in the format of asset dir equals, then the ID with a colon and then the name. So I'm actually going to go bounce back to my wallet here. Let's see here. I need to share screen. And you can see here on my screen, it's very small, but maybe you can see it. But the idea is a lot of these assets that are in here, I do have asset labels for. So I have like reissuance token H, asset H. You can see what they all are showing up in the wallet. And you can actually see the ones that we just created down here at the end, this 10, and this is the one we created as part of the demo. And then we could also have the reissuance token up here as well. I didn't write down that number, but that's the one that we have. So if I wanted to actually label those, what I would do is go to my configuration file and add those lines, and now they show up here. I'm going to skip that for this part of the demo just so we can move forward. This does let me do other interesting things too. What I can do is when I'm making the API calls, I could refer to the asset by its name. So this already exists for things like Bitcoin. Bitcoin already has an asset label by default. So you can just say, I want to send amount. You say the amount, but then you also say asset Bitcoin instead of having to know Bitcoin actually has one of those identifiers just like everything else. All right, now the more interesting asset registry, and this is something that's available for anyone to use. So we use this in our Blockstream Green wallet for Liquid, but we know other wallets that are supporting liquid assets also are free to use this, and this is a way to do that. We also support this with Blockstream.info, so you can see when I showed you the Tether example before, we actually had this information in there. All right, so let's go through here and let's go in. And so there's a couple steps to doing this. And this gets kind of in the weeds real fast, but we have everything documented on docs.blockstream.com under a section called Proof of Ownership, and it talks about the registry. So one of the things I showed you when I looked at the Explorer before was the idea of something called a contract hash. And so when you create an asset, you can commit to this hash, and it's used to represent information about what you're issuing. And the registry requires that there's a couple of parameters here, that it's in JSON format, and then you could add any other auxiliary information you wanted as well. And then you also need to do create what's called a registration file on a domain. And this is a way that we can provide proof that you are actually the entity say you are. So I can't just go and create something called Tether and send it to you and then send you 1 million of it and then rip you off. You can actually see that this is the asset that is stored on something called, on tether.to. So you create there's really 4 things you need to do to create this. You need, decimal places. You have the ability to create an asset name. So this is a longer string. I forget exactly how many characters, but it's a pretty long string. You have the ability to create a ticker. So this is if your wallet wants to just show something very short on it. And then a public key that you can use to prove that you were the one to submit this and to edit the registry in the future. All right, so I'm going to walk you through this real fast. This is normally done with a script. We have the script that this comes from on the link that Neil put in the chat. And those of you watching on YouTube later, docs.blockstream.com, proof of issuance, liquid asset registry, you will find it. So the first thing is we're going to create the JSON contract. We're going to create a transaction that will be used to seed this information. We're going to then issue the asset using raw issue asset and have all the information in it. We're going to host the file on the domain so that Blockstream.info will do it, and then we'll submit the registration info to Blockstream.info. I'm not going to do all of those things, but I did those yesterday, and you can follow along as I go through that process, and you can see how it worked. So the first thing is we had to create the contract hash, and so in this case, I needed an entity. I'm using my own domain, Piscitello.net. Don't worry, there's nothing interesting there except for this file. We have a pub key. So this is something that I created, a key that I can use to sign a message to prove that I was actually the one submitting this. I give a name. I called it Liquid Webinar Coin. It has a precision of 0. It has a ticker of LWC and this version field. And that returns back a hash. So I hash it. I get this 3CB, and that actually is visible in my asset. All right, the next step after that is I'm going to create a transaction, which is basically meant to be a seed to piggyback the issuance on. And I'm going to fund it. I put a little bit more fee rate than I need just because it's creating the fees based on the current size of the transaction, but we expect it to grow after this. So I just did a 3x over the minimum just to make sure it's going to go through. All right, the next thing is I'm going to actually call raw issue asset, and there's a lot of text here, but in short, really what it is it's taking that raw transaction I had before. I'm going to decide how much of the amount I want to do, where is it going to go, the token, how much of the token I want, where is that going to go, and also put in the contract hash. So that's that value from before. I'm going to blind the transaction. This is going to hide all the amounts of the outputs. I'm going to sign it, and then I'm going to send it. So once I do all those things, the transaction now pops up on the network. We can actually see that it's there. And let me go back to the asset registry here, and I will walk you through what you actually see. Let me open it up here. I'm going to share my screen. All right, so this is the asset that was created. It has this D70 prefix. It's the Liquid Webinar coin. You can see that the domain is here. This is all showing up with this information because I've also registered it. And in the demo, we haven't done that yet, but basically we can see the amount that was issued of it. We can see the reissuance tokens. We can then go through here. We can see the amount. We can see that I issued quite a lot of this coin. I did when I did it on my example, I did 200 million and 123 billion of the tokens. But we can see it's all showing up here as well. So this is all visible, all that's showing up in my wallet. If you go back to my wallet, you actually can see that it's in there. All right. So the next step is to get this to actually go through the registry is I need to host a file with the asset proof on that's proving I own this asset on a domain. So basically, I am vouching that this asset is something that I authenticate, and people that trust my domain, they know I own it. Then they'll trust that that's actually a valid resource. You still do need to be careful when you look at an asset. Make sure it's not a lookalike domain name. Those scams do exist. So we're going to go through and add steps and make it easier for you to actually really validate that the token you're getting is authentic. You really want to make sure of this because someone could put a 1 instead of an L here and scam you. So you just got to be careful. Just like when you go to a domain and enter any critical information like passwords. All right, so I do have that hosted, and I'll show you that file when I share my screen next again. And then what you do is you just send this information, the contract and the asset ID, onto the registry, and it now shows up. So I'm going to go back and share real quick here. And let me go to the screen share, and I'll show you just kind of the final product. Switch screen. And go back to this asset. We actually have here an asset directory. This has all of the registered assets right now. You can see that my token is in here along with some other ones like Satoshi Spritz has some interesting tokens you can redeem for. Tether's in here as well. So if you create your asset and register it, it'll show up in here. And you can go see the information about it. So that'll be a good exercise. When you get done with this webinar, you should be able to walk through these steps based on what we have and get some liquid Bitcoin and submit the transaction. The other thing I just want to show you, I do have this file here. Let me pop it up. This is on my domain. You can actually see, if you can zoom in real close, but you can see this asset proof is here, this file that just has this name. Again, the text I don't think is terribly relevant. Just the idea that I have a file with this hexadecimal proves that I was, I am authenticating that. If I pull that file off, all the wallets will no longer trust the registry. So that about wraps it up for the demo and the discussion. And let's see if there's a chance for any more questions in here. There we go. Who is mining the blocks in the demo? Good question. So I didn't cover that too much in this webinar, get into too much background information about Liquid. But Liquid is a blockchain that is federated. So that means that there is a set of 15 members of Liquid that operate what's called a functionary server, and those create blocks. And what they do is they require 11 out of 15 of those to sign the blocks to be valid. So in Bitcoin, you need to have a hash of the block ID that's lower than a certain value. In this case, you just need to have signatures that match the participants right there. The next question is, what type of businesses do you expect will first adopt and benefit from issuing assets on Liquid? Yeah, so this is a good question. So we didn't talk a lot about use cases. Obviously, Tether was a big one. We had a big announcement on Tether this weekend, earlier this week, and the idea is we're going to do this in a future webinar. The idea that Liquid can do something called an atomic swap in a single transaction makes some really interesting use cases. So if you have Tether and I have Liquid Bitcoin, we could do, like, normally if we wanted to trade those things, we have to find a third party to hold both of them and trust them. The second one is we could just trust each other and someone sends first. With an atomic swap, we don't need to do any of that. We just set up the transaction and we can now swap something that we know has value, Liquid Bitcoin, with another thing that we know has value, Tether, and now we've traded are valuable with each other. So this is something that's going to be really, really valuable. You'll see a lot of OTCs looking to adopt this. They don't have to trust each other as much anymore. So that's a very helpful thing. Also, security tokens is the other big thing I think that you're going to see for issuing assets. So that is something that's going to be really big. The idea of the security token is you sometimes want to have restrictions on who can hold it. So maybe you have a token and you want to make sure no one in the US has it. I set up a cosigner, and this is something we're adding through Liquid Securities. Probably we'll have another webinar on that in the future. That would be another possible use case there. Those are the big ones. Also, if you want to issue an asset for like an altcoin, we've actually seen that as well. Someone did create, has a pegged Liquid BCH token on Liquid, but we could do things like, other people could hold things like Ethereum or Litecoin or anything else and issue an asset that corresponds to this. All right, so the next one as well, next question in the list, what kind of wallets will support Liquid assets and who's planning support in the future? I don't know how much I can reveal about some of our partners and people that are planning to do this, but I do know there are at least 3 other wallets that we are working with to support Liquid assets, likely more in the future. Blockstream Green does support it. So that's another wallet that we released. We have a mobile version for iOS and Android, and coming soon, the desktop version will be released. Then the other wallet, you could also use a full node as well, which is what I showed in the demo. So that's, and for who's planning support, I'm going to wait till the people that I know that are working on wallets are willing to say that published as well. All right, so the question from Leah is, what does the future look like for the upgrade to potentially integrate Lightning? Actually, so what we need on that is actually some protocol upgrades. So for Lightning right now, it works right out of the box with Liquid Bitcoin. So that requires nothing. We have it released today. You can download C Lightning and you can start working with Liquid Bitcoin on it right now. And I don't think that's necessarily terribly interesting right now because Liquid is pretty fast and you can already use Bitcoin on Lightning, but you can do some really interesting things with other assets when that's coming. So that does require a protocol change to Lightning to be able to support these kind of extensions. The main thing is because you pay fees in Liquid Bitcoin and the asset that you want to have transacted is different. That's new for Lightning. They do have ways to support this with some future plans, basically where you can piggyback a fee on. So this is something that's in the roadmap, just not available right now. Now, what does that look like? That's where the Liquid Bitcoin Lightning Network part looks interesting. I can use Lightning Network and Liquid to swap with Liquid Bitcoin to swap against main chain Bitcoin. So that provides me a way to swap without payouts. That's really something that's technically possible today. But then you could do things like swaps with Lightning, atomic swaps without even having an on-chain transaction. With other assets. So that's useful. You can do things with like Tether. We've seen people actually are using Tether to pay people in countries where there's poor banking. And that's something where, if you can use Tether without even having to do an on-chain transaction, that's very interesting to a lot of users. So that is, that's kind of the future there. Let me see if there's any other questions in here. I don't see anything popping up. See one question about, will this work with Ethereum 2.0? I think that's a question of, it wouldn't be directly. So if you had any kind of asset, any other altcoin could be represented as a Liquid version. It just requires a federation or single person to actually hold the underlying asset and issue an asset representing it. So if they do successfully launch Ethereum 2.0 in a couple of years, and they have their own token on it, you could have a Liquid Ethereum 2 token. Any other questions? Otherwise, I think that will wrap it up. We will be talking in 2 weeks on another webinar. I believe the topic is going to be about atomic swaps. So that did come up today, and that's really goes into the assets and trading. So look forward to talking to you again. I believe that will be on the 15th, unless the schedule changes before this gets released. Oh, explain more about the registry is another question. Yeah, so the registry itself, if there's anything specific, please add to that question. I can talk about the registry as well. Basically, the registry is collecting proof that someone created something and information about it, and providing a an API for you to actually integrate this into like your wallet. So if a third party is making a wallet, they can look up the asset ID, see if it's in the registry. If it is, give you information like a ticker and display it with the right decimal precision that the issuer expects. So it's just really kind of like a very simple lookup. It's not too complex. The tricky part, and again, this looked worse for the demo just because of looked more complicated, just because it is usually you would just do a script to this. And again, when I did it, all I did was run the script, made a few tweaks to it, and ran with it, and it worked. So you can do the same thing, and basically you're just telling the registry, hey, I am the one who created it, and here's my proof, and here's the information about it. So that's kind of the overview of the registry. We have more information on the docs.blockstream.com as well. And again, if you have any further questions, happy to answer those. There's a question about, will this be published? Yes, we will. We publish this on YouTube as well. All right, going once, going twice. I think that may be it then. Thanks for everyone for, is it separate? Okay, so there's another question. Is it separate from the network? Oh, yeah, so the registry is completely independent. Liquid itself knows nothing about it. So we have a registry, but we're not, the only ones that could do it. Anyone can make their own registry. And it's just a matter of convention that wallets use it. So it is tied to the network in terms of you commit to these values that will allow you to prove when you issued it that it has these things. So yeah, the documentation I believe is in the chat. Neil's put some links up here as well. So if you go to the chat, you can see it docs.blockstream.com, and that will give you more information about it. Going one more time for questions. Going once, going twice. All right, I think that's it. Thanks for everyone for attending. I look forward to talking to you again on the next webinar. Thanks.